The forest is quiet in a way that feels intentional, as if it is holding its breath. Ancient trees rise like pillars of forgotten temple, their roots gripping the earth with the patience of centuries. Somewhere beyond the reach of memory, voices once moved through places like this, not loudly, not in commands, but in murmurs meant only for those who knew how to listen. Imagine standing here long before cities, long before churches or universities, when knowledge did not live in books but in people, and when forgetting something important could mean losing forever. What if some of the most influential minds in European history left behind no writings at all? No signed names, no carved manifestos, no clear explanations in their own words. What if an entire civilization of teachers, judges, philosophers, and spiritual guides chose silence as their legacy, trusting memory over ink and the living world over stone tablets? This is the unsettling realization at the heart of the Druids. They shaped societies, guided kings, and interpreted the will of nature itself. Yet today they exist mostly as shadows, half-remembered and often misunderstood. To modern eyes, the Druids appear like figures wrapped in fog. They are imagined as robed mystics, spellcasters beneath the moon, or vague symbols of pagan mystery. But these images, comforting as they are, conceal a far deeper truth. The real Druids lived in a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was thin, where a river was not merely water moving downhill, but living presence with memory and intention. They believed the land itself was alive, watching, teaching, and responding. In their time, Europe was not divided by borders on maps, but by forests, rivers, and mountains that shaped how people thought and lived. Villages were small, travel was slow, and the natural world was not something outside of human life, but its very foundation. The Druids emerged within this landscape not as rulers, but as intermediaries. They stood between people and nature, between the present moment and ancestral memory, between the living and the unseen. Their power did not come from armies or wealth. It came from understanding. A Druid was expected to know the rhythms of the seasons, the movement of the stars, the laws that govern disputes, and the stories that explain where people came from and where they would go after death. This knowledge was not written down, because writing to them was a kind of forgetting. To write something was to place it outside the living mind, to let it become static and vulnerable. True wisdom, they believed, had to be carried, repeated, spoken, and reshaped with care. This choice had consequences that echo into the present. When later civilizations arrived with their written histories and official records, they found a culture that could not easily defend itself on paper. Roman writers, observing the Druids from the outside, described them with a mixture of fascination and fear. Some portrayed them as philosophers, others as dangerous manipulators who held too much influence over the people. These accounts, written by enemies or outsiders, became a foundation of what we think we know today. Yet even through these distortions, something remarkable remains visible. The Druids were not obsessed with conquest or monuments. They left behind no palaces, no towering statues carved in their own image. Instead, their sacred places were forests, clearings, rivers, and stones already shaped by time. To sit beneath an oak was, in their eyes, to sit in the presence of accumulated wisdom. To observe the mist rising from a river at dawn was to witness a conversation between worlds. There is something deeply unsettling about how little certainty survives. The Druids seem to resist being pinned down, as if they never intended to be fully understood by those who came later. Their teachings were layered, symbolic, and deliberately slow to reveal themselves. Knowledge was not something to be consumed quickly, but something to be earned through patience and attention. In a world that valued speed and expansion, this alone made them dangerous. As centuries passed, their forests were cut down, their groves desecrated, and their students scattered. New belief systems rose, bringing written laws, centralized authority, and a different relationship with the sacred. The old ways were not always violently destroyed. Often, they were quietly absorbed, reshaped, or dismissed as superstition. But silence has a strange endurance. Even when voices fade, the spaces they once occupied do not easily forget. Today, when people speak of Druids, they are often searching for something they feel is missing, a connection to the land, a sense that time moves in cycles rather than straight lines, a belief that wisdom does not always announce itself, but waits to be noticed. The enduring fascination with the Druids says as much about the modern world as it does about the ancient one. We are drawn to them not because we fully understand them, but because we don't. As you settle into this story, imagine letting go of the need for certainty. This is not a tale built on dates and decorations alone. It is a slow walk through memory, myth, and fragmentary history. Like entering a forest at dusk, your eyes will not adjust all at once. Shapes will emerge gradually. Meanings will overlap. Some answers will remain just out of reach. And that is part of the experience. The Druids did not believe that all knowledge was meant to be spoken aloud. Some things, they thought, revealed themselves only when the mind was quiet enough to receive them. Perhaps that is why their story endures best when told slowly, gently, and without force. Not as a lesson to be mastered, but as a presence to sit with. So imagine once more the ancient forest, the sound of leaves shifting in the wind, the distant call of unseen creatures. Somewhere within that quiet, long before written history began to take shape, people stood who believed the world was listening back. And in that belief, they shaped a way of seeing that has never fully disappeared, only waited patiently to be remembered. Long before history learned to speak through ink and parchment, Europe remembered itself through voices. The land did not measure time in years counted forward, but in seasons returning again and again, each one carrying echoes of the last. In this world, memory was not a personal possession, but a shared responsibility. What one generation knew had to be carried carefully into the next, not stored away, not simplified, but lived, spoken, and reenacted until it became part of the body itself. Villages were small and scattered, stitched together by paths worn into the earth rather than roads drawn on maps. Most people rarely traveled far from the place they were born, and yet they felt deeply connected to landscapes far beyond their sight. Rivers carried stories downstream. Hills remembered ancient gatherings. Forests were not obstacles to be cleared, but presences to be entered with caution and respect. In the absence of writing, the world itself became the archive. To modern minds, a society without written records can feel incomplete, even fragile. But for the people of ancient Europe, memory was not weak. It was disciplined. Stories were repeated until they took on rhythm, shape, and endurance. Law was spoken aloud and remembered collectively. Genealogies were recited across generations. Myths were not entertainment alone, but maps of reality, teaching people how to live, when to plant, when to rest, when to fear, and when to celebrate. In such a world, forgetting was dangerous. To lose a story was to lose a lesson. To forget a ritual was to risk imbalance between people and the forces they believed governed the land. This made memory sacred. Those who could remember the most, the clearest, and the deepest were not merely admired. They were needed. This is the quiet soil from which the Druid class would eventually grow. Time itself felt different in this age. Without written calendars pinned to walls, people watched the sky. They noticed how shadows shifted, how stars returned to familiar positions, how animals moved and disappeared with the seasons. Life unfolded slowly, but not aimlessly. Every change carried meaning. Every cycle reinforced the idea that existence was not a straight line, but a circle endlessly turning back on itself. Children learned by listening. Elders taught by telling. Knowledge was not divided into subjects, but woven together. Astronomy, farming, law, spirituality, and storytelling were not separate disciplines. They were different expressions of the same understanding, that humans were part of a living system, not masters over it. To know something was not simply to name it, but to understand how it fit within the whole. Silence played a role as important as speech. Not everything was explained immediately. Some stories were meant to unfold over years, revealing new meanings as the listener aged and changed. This created a deep respect for patience. Wisdom was not rushed. It was allowed to mature, like fruit left on the branch until the moment was right. Without writing, authority did not rest in documents, but in trust. People remembered who had spoken truthfully in the past, who had settled disputes fairly, who understood the old ways without arrogance. Reputation was carried in memory, reinforced through repeated stories of past actions. A leader could not hide behind written law. Every decision lived on in the minds of the community. This world was not peaceful in the way we might imagine. There were conflicts, rivalries, and wars. But even violence was framed within a larger cosmic balance. Feuds followed rules. Retribution was measured. The idea that actions echoed beyond the immediate moment was deeply ingrained. To act without regard for consequence was not just foolish, but dangerous to the harmony of everything around you. As centuries passed, trade routes expanded and outside influences began to brush against these memory-based cultures. New ideas arrived with merchants and travelers. Some were absorbed, others were resisted. Writing itself appeared on the edges of this world, carried by neighboring civilizations that trusted marks on stone more than spoken word. To those rooted in oral tradition, writing could feel cold, detached, and strangely lifeless. It was not that these societies were incapable of writing. They simply chose not to use it for what they considered sacred. Writing fixed things in place. It froze ideas that were meant to remain fluid. Spoken knowledge could adapt subtly with each retelling, responding to changes in the world. Written knowledge could not. Once set down, it became vulnerable to misinterpretation by those who did not understand the context in which it was born. This decision would later be misunderstood as ignorance or backwardness. But in truth, it was a philosophical stance. Knowledge was alive, and living things needed care. They needed to be handled by trained minds, not accessed casually. This belief placed enormous responsibility on those entrusted with memory. To forget, distort, or misuse knowledge was a moral failure. The emergence of specialist rememberers was inevitable. As stories grew longer, laws more complex, and rituals more layered, not everyone could hold everything. Certain individuals dedicated their lives to remembering on behalf of others. They trained their minds with repetition, meditation, and disciplined listening. Over time, these individuals became the backbone of cultural continuity. This is where the world begins to shift subtly. Memory, once evenly shared, starts to concentrate. Those who remember more gain influence, not through force, but through necessity. When disputes arise, people turn to those who remember the old judgments. When rituals must be performed correctly, they seek those who recall the proper words and timings. Authority begins to gather around memory itself. And yet, even as this happens, the world remains deeply communal. Knowledge is not hoarded for personal gain. It is guarded for collective survival. The idea of learning for its own sake, detached from responsibility, does not exist. To know something is to carry the weight of it. As night falls over this ancient Europe, fires are lit and people gather close. Stories flow not in straight lines, but in spirals, circling themes of origin, loss, transformation, and return. Children drift to sleep listening to tales their grandparents once heard as children themselves. In this quiet continuity, time feels both immense and intimate. This is a world that shaped the Druids before they were ever named. A world where memory was sacred, silence was meaningful, and the land itself was a teacher. Understanding this age is essential, because the Druids did not appear suddenly as mysterious figures. They were a natural response to a culture that believed the past lived on only as long as someone was willing to remember it. And as you sit with this image, this slow-moving, listening world, it becomes easy to understand why the loss of such a system would feel like more than historical change. It would feel like amnesia, like waking up in a familiar place and realizing you no longer remember the stories that explain why it matters. Long before stone cities reshaped the horizon, and long before ink fixed thought into permanent lines, Europe existed in a slower rhythm, guided by memory rather than record. People did not experience the past as something distant or abstract. It lived close to them, spoken aloud in stories told beside fires, carried in songs sung during work, and preserved in rituals repeated with careful attention. To remember was not a passive act. It was a responsibility shared by the entire community, a quiet agreement that knowledge would survive only if it was actively kept alive. In this world, the land itself functioned as a living archive. Hills were not just rises in the earth, but places where gatherings had occurred for generations. Rivers were paths of both travel and tradition, carrying stories as surely as they carried water. Forests marked boundaries not merely between territories, but between the familiar and the unknown. Every feature of the landscape held layers of meaning that only revealed themselves to those who had listened long enough. Time did not rush forward here. Without written calendars to divide life into numbered segments, people measured the passing of existence through natural cycles. The return of certain stars signaled when prepare the fields. The lengthening of shadows marked the approach of colder months. Life was arranged around observation rather than schedules, and this fostered a deep attentiveness to subtle change. Nothing was wasted, especially not experience. Children grew up surrounded by stories long before they understood them. These stories were not simplified for youth. Instead, they were allowed to unfold gradually, revealing new layers as the listener matured. A tale heard at 7 years old would sound entirely different at 30. This was intentional. Knowledge was designed to grow alongside the individual, rather than being consumed all at once. Law existed, but it lived in people, not documents. Agreements were remembered collectively, reinforced through repetition and public recitation. When disputes arose, resolution depended on those who could recall how similar conflicts had been handled in the past. Justice was not abstract. It was deeply personal, tied to reputation and memory. A person known to act fairly would be trusted again. One known for dishonesty could not hide behind written loopholes. This made forgetting a serious danger. To forget a boundary agreement could lead to conflict. To forget a ritual could invite misfortune. To forget a lineage could dissolve claims of responsibility. Memory, therefore, was trained deliberately. People repeated important information rhythmically, embedding it in song, poetry, and structured storytelling. These techniques were not artistic choices alone, but survival strategies. Silence, too, had meaning. Knowledge was not always offered freely or immediately. Some truths were revealed only after years of listening, watching, and proving patience. This cultivated humility. Not knowing everything right away was not a flaw, but an expected part of growth. Wisdom did not announce itself loudly. It waited. As trade slowly expanded and distant cultures brushed against this memory-based world, new ideas arrived alongside unfamiliar customs. Some communities encountered writing for the first time, brought by travelers who trusted marks on stone and parchment more than spoken word. To those rooted in oral tradition, writing felt oddly disconnected. Once something was written, it no longer breathed. It could not adapt. It could not respond to the subtle shifts of context that living speech could accommodate. This was not ignorance. It was choice. Writing fixed meaning in place, while memory allowed meaning to move. In a world where survival depended on adaptability, rigidity felt dangerous. Knowledge, like nature, needed flexibility. It needed to change shape slightly as circumstances changed, while still retaining its core. Over time, as stories grew longer and laws more complex, not everyone could carry everything. Certain individuals began to specialize in remembering. They listened more carefully, trained longer, and committed themselves to holding knowledge not for personal power, but for communal continuity. This specialization did not yet create rigid hierarchy, but it did mark the beginning of something new. Memory began to gather weight. Those who remembered most became essential. They were consulted not because they demanded authority, but because others relied on them. This reliance planted the earliest seeds of a class whose influence would one day shape entire societies. The Druids did not emerge suddenly from nowhere. They rose naturally from a culture that understood forgetting as a form of loss far greater than physical destruction. As night settled over ancient Europe, fires burned low and voices softened. Stories flowed gently, weaving the past into the present. In this world of listening and remembering, knowledge did not belong to individuals. It belonged to time itself, carried forward by those willing to hold it carefully. From this soil of disciplined memory and shared responsibility, a distinct group slowly took shape. They were not warriors or kings, but something quieter and, in many ways, more powerful. As societies grew larger and more complex, the need for mediators between people, tradition, and the unseen became unavoidable. This was the space the Druids would come to occupy. They did not stand above society, but within it, woven into its structure like roots beneath the soil. Their authority was not inherited through blood alone, nor enforced through violence. It was earned through years of training, listening, and restraint. To become a Druid was not a matter of ambition. It was a commitment that reshaped an entire life. Young apprentices entered long periods of instruction that could last decades. During this time, they learned to memorize vast bodies of law, poetry, cosmology, and moral teaching. This was not rote memorization alone. They were taught how ideas connected, how one story echoed another, how human actions mirrored natural cycles. Knowledge was taught as a living system, not a collection of facts. The Druids served many roles at once. They advised kings, but did not rule. They settled disputes, but did not enforce punishment through force. They led rituals, but did not claim ownership over sacred. Their strength lay in balance. They moved between worlds, between classes, between the visible and the unseen. This position made them both respected and feared. A druid could halt a battle by stepping between opposing forces, invoking laws older than any individual ruler. They could declare certain days sacred, forbidding violence or labor. Their words carried weight because they were believed to reflect deeper truths than personal desire. Their refusal to write down sacred knowledge reinforced their authority while also limiting it. Knowledge remained difficult to access, guarded by discipline rather than secrecy. To learn was to submit to patience. This prevented misuse while ensuring continuity. At the same time, it made the entire system vulnerable. If the chain of memory broke, there would be nothing to retrieve. The Druids understood this risk, yet accepted it. To them, wisdom preserved through living minds was worth the danger of loss. Writing, they believed, could give the illusion of permanence while encouraging neglect. Memory demanded constant care. It kept knowledge active, engaged, and accountable. Their worldview rested on the belief that the universe was ordered, but not rigid. Everything moved in cycles. Birth led to death, death to renewal. Human law mirrored natural law. Actions carried consequences beyond immediate outcomes. This philosophy shaped their role as judges and teachers. Justice was not about punishment alone, but about restoring balance. Emotionally, the Druids cultivated distance without detachment. They were expected to feel deeply, yet not act impulsively. This emotional discipline allowed them to serve as stabilizing forces in times of crisis. When fear spread through communities, people turned to those who understood the longer rhythms of existence. As their influence grew, so did the suspicion of outsiders. To neighboring powers built on conquest and record-keeping, the Druids appeared dangerous. They controlled thought rather than territory. They shaped belief rather than borders. Their power was invisible and therefore difficult to confront. Still, within their own world, the Druids were not tyrants. They were caretakers of continuity. Their highest responsibility was not command, but preservation. They carried the past so that the future would not wander blindly. To understand the Druids is to understand the world that made them necessary. They were not anomalies, nor mystical accidents. They were the natural outcome of a culture that trusted memory over monuments and listening over declaration. And in their quiet authority, they held together a way of life balanced delicately between human society and the living land itself. To understand the Druids, one must first understand what it meant to live in a world where writing existed, yet was deliberately kept at a distance from what mattered most. This choice was not born of limitation, but of discipline. Sacred knowledge, in the Druidic worldview, was not something to be stored externally, where it could be accessed without effort or responsibility. It was something that had to live inside the mind, shaped by memory, emotion, repetition, and time. Training to become a Druid was not a short journey. It could last 20 years or more, not because the material was endlessly complex, but because the mind itself needed to be reshaped. Apprentices were taught to listen long before they were taught to speak. They observed rituals without explanation, memorized verses without being told their meanings, and learned patience as a foundational virtue rather than a passive one. Understanding was expected to arrive gradually, like dawn rather than lightning. Memory was treated as a sacred muscle. It was exercised daily through recitation, storytelling, and mental discipline. Long poems containing law, genealogy, cosmology, and moral guidance were learned by heart. These were not repeated mechanically. Each recitation was slightly alive, shaped by breath, rhythm, and the presence of the listener. In this way, knowledge remained flexible, responsive, and deeply human. Writing, by contrast, was seen as rigid. Once something was written down, it could no longer respond to context. It could be read by someone unprepared, misunderstood, or stripped of its deeper layers. The Druids feared not ignorance, but shallow understanding. Knowledge without discipline was considered dangerous. To know something sacred without the maturity to carry it was to invite imbalance. There was also a spiritual dimension to this rejection of writing. Words spoken aloud were believed to carry breath, and breath was life. Spoken knowledge moved through the body, resonating in the chest and echoing in the ears of others. Written words sat silently, detached from the living world. To trust writing with sacred truths felt, to the Druids, like placing a living thing in a cage. This approach demanded extraordinary mental endurance. Apprentices trained their memories not only through repetition, but through visualization and association. Stories were linked to landscapes. Laws were tied to natural cycles. Moral lessons were embedded in myth. This made forgetting less likely, because knowledge was not isolated. It existed as part of an interconnected web. Silence was an essential part of this training. Periods of quiet reflection were not breaks from learning, but integral to it. Apprentices were expected to sit with unresolved questions without demanding immediate answers. This cultivated comfort with uncertainty. Not knowing everything right away was considered a strength, not a weakness. Discipline extended beyond the mind into behavior. A Druid was expected to speak carefully, to avoid unnecessary words, and understand the weight language carried. Words could heal, but they could also harm. Because nothing was written down, spoken words lingered in memory. A careless statement could echo for years. This created a culture of attentiveness. Listeners paid close attention, not just to what was said, but to how it was said. Tone, timing, and context mattered. Teaching was subtle. Lessons were rarely direct. Instead, students were guided toward understanding through story, analogy, and observation. Knowledge revealed itself rather than being delivered. The refusal to write also protected sacred teachings from external control. Writing makes knowledge portable. It allows it to be taken, copied, altered, and used without consent. Oral knowledge resisted this. To access it, one had to enter the community, earn trust, and commit to its values. This made the Druidic system resilient in one sense, yet fragile in another. Fragility was accepted as the price of integrity. The Druids understood that their knowledge could be lost if the chain of memory broke, but they believed that written preservation created a false sense of security. A text could survive while its meaning died. Memory demanded engagement. It forced each generation to actively choose preservation. There was also a social dimension to this choice. Writing can create distance between teacher and student. Oral transmission required presence. Knowledge passed face to face, breath to breath. This fostered deep relationships between generations. Teachers knew their students intimately, understanding when they were ready for certain truths and when they were not. Because learning was so demanding, becoming a Druid was not for everyone. This was not elitism in the modern sense, but recognition of responsibility. Sacred knowledge carried consequences. Those who held it were expected to live according to it. Hypocrisy was not tolerated. A Druid who failed morally did not simply lose status. They lost trust. This system shaped how Druids thought about truth itself. Truth was not static. It was layered. A myth could be true without being literal. A story could convey law without naming it explicitly. Meaning shifted depending on who listened and when. Writing flattened these layers. Oral tradition preserved them. Even law was treated this way. Rather than rigid codes, Druidic law operated through precedent and principle. Past judgments were remembered, discussed, and adapted. This allowed justice to remain humane. Circumstance mattered. Intention mattered. The goal was not punishment, but restoration of balance. Emotionally, this created a different relationship with knowledge. Learning was not a race. It was a lifelong process. Even experienced Druids continued to listen, to refine, to question. There was no final authority captured in text. Authority lived in collective memory and ongoing dialogue. When outsiders later encountered this system, they often misunderstood it. To literate cultures that equated writing with civilization, the Druids appeared primitive or secretive. Their refusal to write sacred teachings was interpreted as ignorance or deception. In reality, it was a profound philosophical stance about the nature of wisdom. This misunderstanding would have serious consequences. When the Druids faced oppression, their greatest strength became their greatest vulnerability. Without written records, their teachings could not be easily recovered once their communities were disrupted. What survived did so through fragments, echoes, and second-hand accounts. Yet even this loss carries meaning. The Druids trusted that some knowledge was not meant to endure unchanged forever. Like forests, cultures grow, die, and regenerate. What mattered was not permanence, but alignment with the living world. Knowledge that could not survive without force perhaps did not deserve to. As you imagine a Druid apprentice sitting quietly, repeating verses under an ancient tree, it becomes clear that this was not a system designed for expansion or dominance. It was designed for depth. It valued quality of understanding over quantity of information. In a world increasingly overwhelmed by written words, this ancient discipline offers a quiet contrast. The Druids believed that wisdom was something you became, not something you possessed. By refusing to write their sacred knowledge, they ensured that learning remained a transformative process. Knowledge lived and died with people, just as people lived and died within the larger cycles of nature. And in this fragile, demanding system, they found not weakness, but meaning. To the Druids, the world was not divided into sacred and ordinary places. The entire landscape breathed with meaning, and every element within it had something to teach. Forests were not simply collections of trees, but vast libraries of living wisdom. Rivers were not obstacles to be crossed, but moving stories, carrying memory from distant sources to unseen destinations. Stones, weathered and silent, were considered elders, holding the weight of time in their stillness. Learning did not happen in enclosed rooms or formal halls. It happened while walking slowly beneath canopies of leaves, while listening to wind move through branches, while observing the quiet patience of moss growing across stone. Nature was not a backdrop to human life. It was an active participant, constantly offering instruction to those willing to observe without haste. The Druids believed that knowledge emerged from relationship. To understand something, one had to spend time with it. A river could not be understood by measuring its width alone. It had to be watched across seasons, seen in flood and drought, heard at night and at dawn. Only then could its character be known. This approach shaped how Druids thought about wisdom itself. It was not extracted. It was earned. Forests held particular significance, not because they were mysterious in the modern sense, but because they represented balance. Light and shadow coexisted there. Growth and decay occurred side by side. Life fed on death without conflict. In these spaces, Druids found a reflection of the human condition. To live wisely was not to eliminate darkness, but to understand its place. Sacred groves were chosen carefully, often marked by ancient trees whose age alone commanded respect. These were not planted temples. They were discovered, recognized by their presence rather than constructed by design. The Druids believed that certain places already carried a concentration of meaning, shaped by natural forces and human attention over generations. Their role was to listen to these places, not to reshape them. Rivers served as boundaries and bridges between worlds. Flowing water symbolized transition, movement, and continuity. Rituals performed near rivers acknowledged the constant passage of time and the impossibility of holding on to any single moment. To step into a river was to step into change, a reminder that life, like water, does not pause. Stones, especially those arranged in circles or standing alone in fields, carried a different kind of lesson. Their stillness contrasted sharply with the movement of water and wind. Stones did not rush. They endured. For the Druids, this endurance was not lifelessness, but a deeper form of presence. Stones witnessed generations come and go without needing to intervene. They taught patience and perspective. The alignment of certain stones with celestial events reinforced the belief that the land was in conversation with the sky. The rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the moon, and the return of stars were not distant phenomena. They were part of an interconnected system that included human life. Standing stones became points of focus where these relationships could be observed and honored. Weather was also treated as a teacher rather than an inconvenience. Storms were not simply disruptions, but expressions of balance being restored. Long periods of calm or chaos both carried lessons. Druids paid attention to patterns, noticing how certain conditions preceded others. This attentiveness was practical, aiding agriculture and survival, but it was also spiritual. It reinforced the idea that nothing happened in isolation. Animals were observed with similar care. The migration of birds, the behavior of deer, the persistence of insects all offered insights into the health of the land. Animals were not romanticized, but respected. They followed natural law without hesitation, providing examples of instinctual wisdom that humans often ignored. This deep engagement with the environment shaped Druidic rituals. Ceremonies were timed in natural events rather than imposed schedules. A ritual performed at the wrong moment was considered meaningless, no matter how well executed. Timing was everything. The land had to be ready to listen. Teaching within this framework was experiential. Apprentices were not simply told what a place meant. They were brought there repeatedly until understanding arose naturally. A grove visited in summer taught different lessons than the same grove in winter. Knowledge unfolded as conditions changed. This approach fostered humility. No matter how much one learned, the land always held more. Nature could not be mastered or fully understood. It could only be approached with respect and patience. This prevented arrogance, reminding Druids that wisdom was provisional and contextual. The natural world also served as a moral guide. Balance observed in ecosystems became a model for human behavior. Excess was discouraged. Waste was seen as disrespectful. Taking more than needed disrupted harmony, inviting consequences not just socially, but spiritually. Even death was understood through nature. The decay of fallen trees nourished new growth. Animals fed on what had died, continuing the cycle. This made mortality less frightening. Death was not an enemy, but a transition within a larger pattern. As forests were cleared and landscapes altered by later civilizations, this way of seeing the world became harder to maintain. But traces of it lingered. Place names preserved memory. Folk customs echoed ancient rituals. The land itself retained its lessons for those who knew how to listen. To sit quietly beside an old river or beneath an ancient tree is to touch something the Druids once understood intimately. Their wisdom did not reside in abstract philosophy alone, but in direct relationship with the living world. In learning from forests, rivers, and stones, they learned how to live with restraint, awareness, and reverence. The sacred world was not separate from daily life. It was life, experienced slowly and attentively. And in that attentiveness, the Druids found a source of guidance more enduring than any written text, a teacher that still waits, patiently, for those willing to listen. Among all the living beings that shaped the Druidic imagination, trees stood apart. They were not admired merely for their beauty or usefulness, but for their presence across time. A tree could outlive generations of humans, standing quietly while lives unfolded beneath its branches. To the Druids, this endurance was not accidental. Trees were witnesses, storing memory in their rings, absorbing seasons, storms, and sunlight without complaint. They were teachers rooted in place. The oak held a position of particular reverence. Its slow growth, immense strength, and long life made a symbol of stability in a world defined by change. Oaks did not rush. They took decades to mature fully, and centuries to reach their greatest presence. For the Druids, this patience mirrored the kind of wisdom they valued most. Knowledge, like the oak, could not be forced. It required time, care, and deep roots. Standing beneath an oak was believed to sharpen perception. The canopy filtered light into shifting patterns, creating an atmosphere that encouraged quiet observation. In these spaces, Druids taught and learned, believing that the tree itself shaped the mind of those who lingered beneath it. The oak was not worshipped as a god, but respected as a bridge between worlds, its roots reaching into the earth while its branches stretched toward the sky. Mistletoe, by contrast, embodied mystery and tension. It did not grow from the ground, but appeared suspended between heaven and earth, clinging to the branches of trees without touching soil. This unusual way of living fascinated the Druids. Mistletoe seemed to exist outside ordinary rules, neither fully grounded nor entirely airborne. Because of this, it became a symbol of liminality, of thresholds and transitions. Harvesting mistletoe was treated as a sacred act. It was approached carefully, often with ritual preparation, because removing it carelessly was believed to disturb the balance it represented. The plant's evergreen nature, remaining vibrant even in winter, reinforced its association with endurance and renewal. In the darkest months, when much of the land appeared dormant, mistletoe reminded observers that life persisted quietly beneath the surface. Other trees carried their own lessons. The yew, often found near burial sites, was associated with death and rebirth. Its longevity and ability to regenerate made it a living reminder that endings were not final. The ash, tall and flexible, symbolized connection and resilience. The hazel, linked with wisdom and inspiration, was associated with sudden insight, the kind that arrives unexpectedly after long contemplation. To the Druids, these associations were not arbitrary symbols imposed upon nature. They emerged from observation. Trees behaved differently, aged differently, responded differently to damage and weather. Their characteristics became metaphors grounded in reality rather than imagination. Symbolism was not abstract. It was experiential. This language of trees extended beyond spiritual teaching into law and custom. Meetings held beneath certain trees carried greater weight. Oaths sworn near them were believed to bind more deeply. The presence of a tree, especially one known and respected by the community, added gravity to human decisions. It reminded those involved that their actions would echo beyond their own lifetimes. Trees also shaped the Druidic understanding of ancestry. Just as branches spread outward from a single trunk, families and clans traced their origins through shared roots. Genealogies were spoken of as living trees, constantly growing, occasionally losing branches, but always connected. This reinforced a sense of belonging not just to the present, but to a long continuum of past and future lives. Seasonal change played a crucial role in the symbolic language. The shedding of leaves in autumn was not seen as decay, but as preparation. Trees conserved energy, withdrew inward, and waited. In spring, they returned with quiet confidence. This cycle mirrored human life, with its periods of growth, rest, loss, and renewal. Observing trees helped people accept change without panic. Even fallen trees retained significance. A tree lying on a forest floor was not considered useless or dead in a final sense. It became a host for new life, feeding insects, fungi, and seedlings. This transformation reinforced the Druidic belief that nothing truly ended. Everything changed form, contributing to balance in unseen ways. The Druids' relationship with trees discouraged exploitation. Cutting a tree was not forbidden, but it required intention and respect. Trees were taken when necessary, not carelessly. Before felling, one acknowledged a life being altered. This practice did not romanticize nature, but it prevented thoughtless consumption. Taken from the land carried responsibility. In this worldview, forests were communities rather than resources. Each tree contributed to the health of the whole. This understanding shaped how Druids thought about human society as well. Individuals mattered, but so did their relationships. Strength came not from dominance, but from interconnectedness. The symbolic language of trees also shaped Druidic storytelling. Myths featured transformations between human and arboreal forms, not as punishment, but as continuity. Becoming a tree was not a loss of identity, but a change in expression. It allowed characters to endure beyond human limitations, observing quietly as time moved on. This belief softened the fear of mortality. If humans were part of the same living system as trees, then death was not exile, but reintegration. The body returned to the soil, nourishing new growth. The spirit moved on, just as sap rose again after winter. Trees made this cycle visible. As centuries passed and forests were cleared, much of this language faded from daily life. Trees became commodities, measured in timber rather than meaning. Yet even now, people feel something different when standing beneath an ancient tree. A sense of calm, of perspective, of quiet connection still arises, unbidden and difficult to explain. This lingering response suggests that the Druids were not inventing meaning where none existed. They were articulating a relationship humans naturally feel when given time and silence. Trees slow the mind. They invite patience. They remind us that life is larger than urgency. To learn the language of trees, as the Druids once did, was to learn how to listen without demanding answers. It was to accept that wisdom grows gradually, shaped by seasons of waiting as much as seasons of action. In honoring oak, mistletoe, and the many voices of the forest, the Druids were honoring a way of being that valued depth over speed and presence over control. And perhaps that is why this ancient symbolism still resonates. Long after the Druids themselves have faded into history, the trees they revered continue to stand, offering the same quiet lessons to anyone willing to pause, breathe, and listen. For the Druids, time was not something that moved forward and disappeared behind them. It was something that turned, returned, and revealed itself again and again in familiar forms. They did not experience the year as a straight line of dates, but as a living cycle marked by fire, shadow, growth, and rest. Each turning of the year was both a repetition and a renewal, carrying memory forward while allowing change. The rhythm of this calendar was shaped by the land itself. Long before mechanical clocks or written schedules, people watched the sun's path across the sky and the length of shadows at dawn and dusk. They noticed when light lingered longer in the evening and when darkness seemed to reclaim the day. These subtle shifts were not abstract observations. They guided planting, harvesting, movement, and ritual. Life unfolded in response to these patterns. Fire played a central role in marking these transitions. It was not merely a source of warmth or light, but a symbol of transformation. Fire consumed, purified, and illuminated. At certain points in the year, great communal fires were lit, not to dominate the darkness, but to acknowledge its presence and importance. Light and shadow were partners, not enemies. One of the most significant moments in the Druidic year occurred as the harvest ended and the days grew noticeably shorter. This was a time when the boundary between worlds was believed to thin. The living honored the dead, not with fear, but with recognition. Ancestors were remembered as continuing participants in the cycle of existence. The past did not vanish. It returned quietly, asking to be acknowledged. During this season, the natural world appeared to withdraw. Leaves fell, animals prepared for scarcity. Fields lay bare. Rather than resisting this descent into stillness, the Druids embraced it. Darkness was not seen as evil or empty, but as fertile. It was a time of gestation, when unseen processes prepared the ground for future growth. As winter deepened, rituals became more introspective. Fires burned low and steady, emphasizing endurance rather than spectacle. Stories were told slowly, often focusing on origin, loss, and return. These narratives reinforced the idea that life did not vanish in winter. It simply moved inward. When the light began to return, it did so subtly at first. The days lengthened almost imperceptibly. This was not celebrated with sudden noise or excess, but with quiet attention. The return of light was a promise, not a guarantee. It reminded people that cycles continued even when hope felt distant. As the year turned toward growth, fire took on a different meaning. It became a symbol of energy and expansion. Communal flames marked moments of transition into active life. People and livestock passed between fires as acts of purification and protection, acknowledging the vulnerability that came with renewed movement. Spring was not merely a season of beauty. It was a test. New life was fragile. Fields needed careful tending. The balance between action and restraint became crucial. The calendar reflected this tension, marking moments when it was safe to act and moments when patience was still required. Summer brought fullness and intensity. Light dominated the day, and activity reached its peak. Rituals during this time honored abundance while warning against excess. The Druids understood that too much light, like too much darkness, could be dangerous. Balance remained the guiding principle. As the harvest approached, gratitude became central. The fruits of labor were acknowledged as gifts rather than entitlements. Rituals reinforced humility, reminding communities that survival depended on cooperation with natural forces beyond human control. Throughout the year, the Druidic calendar served not as a schedule, but as a teacher. It shaped emotional rhythms, as much as practical ones. People learned when to act boldly and when to withdraw, when to celebrate and when to grieve, when to speak and when to listen. This cyclical understanding of time softened the fear of change. Loss was not final. Hardship was not meaningless. Each phase carried purpose within a larger pattern. Even suffering had a place, preparing the ground for transformation. The calendar also reinforced communal bonds. Rituals were not solitary experiences. They gathered people together at key moments, aligning individual lives with collective rhythm. This shared sense of timing created stability, especially in uncertain conditions. Fire, shadow, and season worked together to remind people that they were participants in something larger than themselves. Time was not an enemy to be conquered, but a companion to be respected. To move against its rhythm was to invite imbalance. As later cultures imposed linear calendars and rigid schedules, this relationship with time began to erode. Days became units to be filled rather than experiences to be lived. The slow wisdom of cycles gave way to urgency and accumulation. Yet traces of this ancient calendar still echo in modern life. Seasonal celebrations, even when stripped of their original meaning, retain a sense of transition. People still feel a quiet shift as days shorten or lengthen, even if they cannot explain why. The Druids understood something fundamental about the human mind and spirit. We are shaped by rhythm. We need periods of light and darkness, activity and rest. When these rhythms are ignored, imbalance follows. In their sacred calendar, time itself became a form of guidance. It taught without words, corrected without punishment, and renewed without erasing what came before. Fire marked transformation. Shadow offered rest. Together, they carried the year forward, not as a march toward an ending, but as an endless return. To live within this rhythm was to trust that life, in all its changes, moved toward balance. And in that trust, the Druids found a sense of peace that did not depend on control, but on attentiveness. For the Druids, the question of what happens after death was not approached with dread or urgency. It was not framed as a final judgment waiting at the end of life, nor as an abrupt disappearance into nothingness. Instead, death was understood as a quiet turning, a shift from one state of being into another within an ongoing cycle. The soul, like the seasons, did not end. It moved. This belief shaped how Druids lived as much as how they understood dying. If the soul continued, then life was not a single, isolated chance to matter. Actions carried forward. Choices echoed beyond the visible horizon. Courage, honor, and restraint were not merely moral ideals, but investments in continuity. To live well was to prepare the soul for its next unfolding, whatever form that might take. Reincarnation, as later writers would describe it, was not imagined as a neat or predictable process. It was not a reward system, nor a punishment. It was transformation. Just as water changes shape without ceasing to be water, the soul changed expression without losing its essence. Birth and death were doorways, not destinations. This understanding softened the fear that often surrounds mortality. Death was not welcomed, but it was not resisted with panic. Grief existed, but it was tempered by expectation of return. Ancestors were not gone. They were elsewhere, moving through another phase of existence, still connected to the living world through memory, place, and ritual. Funerary practices reflected this belief. Burials often included personal items, not because the dead were thought to need them in a literal sense, but because identity was understood to persist. The soul carried memory. It carried character. Objects served as symbols of continuity, rather than tools for survival beyond the grave. The boundary between the living and the dead was considered thin, especially at certain times of the year. This did not mean that spirits constantly intruded into daily life. Instead, it suggested proximity. The dead were near, listening, observing, and occasionally influencing. Remembering them was not an act of nostalgia, but of relationship. This belief placed great importance on ancestry. To know where one came from was to know something about where one was going. Lineage was not merely biological. It was spiritual. The deeds and failures of those who came before shaped the conditions into which new lives emerged. Responsibility moved both forward and backward through time. The Druids did not imagine the soul as entirely separate from a natural world. Human existence was one expression among many. After death, the soul might move through other forms of life, learning through different perspectives. This did not diminish human experience. It placed it within a broader tapestry of being. Such beliefs encourage humility. If one might return in another form, then all forms deserve respect. Animals, plants, and even landscapes were treated with care, not only because they sustained human life, but because they participated in the same cycle. Harm done carelessly could echo back in unexpected ways. The concept of an otherworld occupied an important place in Druidic thought. This realm was not distant or abstract. It existed alongside the everyday world, overlapping it like a reflection on water. Certain places were believed to offer easier passage between these realms. Forest clearings, riverbanks, and ancient mounds were approached with quiet awareness. The otherworld was not imagined as perfect or eternal bliss. It was simply another phase of existence, governed by its own rhythms and challenges. Time behaved differently there. Stories described journeys that felt brief to the traveler, but long to those left behind, or the reverse. These narratives emphasized that reality was layered, not singular. Dreams were considered one of the most common ways the soul touched this other realm. In sleep, the boundaries loosened. The mind wandered. Messages arrived not as clear instructions, but as symbols requiring reflection. Dreams were not blindly trusted, but neither were they dismissed. They were invitations to listen more deeply. This understanding of the soul shaped Druidic ethics. Because life continued, consequences matter beyond immediate outcomes. Acts of cruelty did not simply end when the act was over. They followed the soul forward, shaping future experiences. Likewise, acts of generosity and courage created currents that carried forward unseen. The belief in continuity also reframed suffering. Pain was not always punishment, nor was it meaningless. It was part of a longer journey whose full shape could not be seen from a single lifetime. This did not excuse injustice or discourage compassion. Instead, it encouraged patience and depth of response rather than despair. Warriors influenced by Druidic teaching were said to face battle with unusual calm. Death was still feared, but it was not absolute. This did not make life cheap. It made it serious. Each life was a chapter, not the entire book. The Druids themselves were believed to cultivate a particular awareness of this continuity. Through training, ritual, and contemplation, they learned to loosen their attachment to immediate identity. This did not erase individuality. It placed it within a larger flow. A Druid was not defined solely by personal ambition, but by service to balance across time. This perspective also affected how Druids responded to loss. Mourning was real and deeply felt. Tears were not suppressed. But grief was accompanied by remembrance rather than finality. Stories of the dead were told to keep them present, not trapped in the past, but active within communal memory. As later belief systems emphasized final judgment and eternal separation, this gentle continuity faded from common understanding. Death became an ending rather than transition. Fear replaced familiarity. Yet traces of the older view lingered in folklore, in the feeling that certain places were haunted not by malice, but by presence. Even today, many people experience a quiet sense that life does not simply stop. This intuition often arises not from doctrine, but from observation, the way energy moves, the way patterns repeat, the way something of a person seems to remain after they are gone. These impressions echo the Druidic understanding of the soul. To see death as a passage rather than a wall changes how one lives. Urgency softens. Attention deepens. Moments are valued not because they are scarce, but because they are connected. Life becomes part of a longer conversation rather than a solitary statement. For the Druids, the soul's journey was not something to be mapped precisely. Mystery was accepted. What mattered was alignment, not certainty. To live in harmony with the land, with others, and with oneself was the best preparation for whatever lay beyond. In this worldview, death did not stand opposite life. It stood beside it, quietly like night beside day. Each made the other meaningful. And within that balance, the Druids found a calm acceptance that allowed them to face both living and die with a steady, listening presence, trusting that nothing truly vanished, but only changed its way of being. In a world without written codes or stone-carved statutes, justice could not hide behind abstraction. It lived in memory, reputation, and the shared understanding of what kept a community whole. For the Druids, law was not a mechanism of control, but a living practice aimed at balance. It did not exist to punish, but to restore harmony where it had been disturbed. Right and wrong were not rigid categories enforced from above. They were relational concepts shaped by context, intention, and consequence. Every dispute carried its own story, and no two situations were ever entirely the same. This required a form of judgment that was attentive, patient, and deeply human. The Druids were trusted with this role not because they claimed authority, but because they were believed to understand the deeper patterns governing human behavior and natural order. Justice was inseparable from memory. Past decisions mattered, not as fixed precedents, but as guides. A Druid judging a conflict would recall similar situations from earlier generations, weighing how balance had been restored before and whether those outcomes had endured. Law evolved slowly, shaped by experience rather than decree. This flexibility allowed it to remain relevant without losing continuity. Truth, in this system, was not something extracted through force or confession. It was something revealed through careful listening. Witnesses spoke, but so did silence, the way a person hesitated. The emotions beneath their words and their history within the community all contributed to understanding. The Druids believed that truth carried a certain weight and consistency. Lies required effort to maintain. Over time, they collapsed under their own strain. Oaths were central to this process. Spoken promises were considered binding because words carried breath, and breath carried life. To swear falsely was not just a social offense. It was a spiritual one. A broken oath disrupted balance, not only between individuals, but between the human world and the unseen forces believed to observe it. Because nothing was written, an oath lived on in the minds of those who heard it. Shame and accountability were communal, not private. Punishment, when necessary, focused on repair rather than revenge. Compensation was preferred to incarceration. Restoring what had been damaged mattered more than inflicting suffering. If property was stolen, it was returned or replaced. If injury was caused, care and recompense followed. The goal was to reintegrate the offender into the community, not to isolate them permanently. Exile was considered one of the harshest penalties, not because it was violent, but because it severed connection. To be cut off from land, kin, and shared memory was to lose one's place in the world. This consequence reinforced the importance of belonging and responsibility. Actions that endangered the whole could not be tolerated, but neither were they answered lightly. The Druids themselves were expected to embody fairness. Their authority depended entirely on trust. A Druid who showed favoritism or allowed personal interest to influence judgment risked losing credibility. Without written law to shield them, their decisions were constantly measured against outcomes. Did peace return? Did resentment fade? Did balance endure? These results mattered more than formal correctness. This system required emotional intelligence as much as intellectual discipline. A Druid needed to sense when firmness was required and when mercy would serve better. Too much rigidity could harden conflict. Too much leniency could invite chaos. Balance lay in discernment, not rules alone. The communal nature of justice also meant that everyone carried some responsibility for its success. Witnesses were expected to speak honestly. Elders contributed memory. Families participated in resolution. Justice was not outsourced to an institution. It was lived collectively. This approach discouraged secrecy. Because disputes were addressed publicly, actions carried visible consequences. Reputation mattered deeply. To be known as honorable opened doors. To be known as deceitful closed them. Social memory became a powerful regulator of behavior, often more effective than threat of punishment. The Druids believed that imbalance, if left unresolved, did not simply disappear. It manifested elsewhere in illness, poor harvests, or social unrest. Whether these connections were symbolic or literal mattered less than the effect they produced. People took responsibility seriously because they believed their actions shaped the wider world. This belief extended beyond individual disputes into governance. Kings and leaders were not above the law. They were subject to it. A ruler who ignored Druidic counsel risked losing legitimacy. Leadership was framed as stewardship rather than dominance. Authority existed to serve balance, not personal ambition. The absence of chains and prisons did not indicate weakness. It reflected confidence in communal bonds and moral education. People raised within the system internalized expectations from an early age. Justice did not arrive suddenly at the moment of wrongdoing. It was present continuously, shaping behavior long before conflict arose. Fear was not the primary motivator. Belonging was. To act unjustly was to risk exclusion, shame, and loss of trust. These were powerful deterrents in tightly knit societies where survival depended on cooperation. As external powers with written laws and centralized enforcement encountered Druidic justice, they often misunderstood it. The lack of visible punishment appeared ineffective. The flexibility looked like inconsistency. But these observers missed the subtle strength of a system grounded in relationship rather than coercion. When later systems replaced this approach, something intangible was lost. Law became more predictable, but also more distant. Justice moved from conversation to document, from memory to archive. Efficiency increased, but empathy thinned. The Druidic vision of justice reminds us that fairness is not only about consistency, but about understanding. It asks not only what rule was broken, but why, and how balance might be restored without further harm. It treats people as participants in a shared world rather than subjects of authority. In this way, justice became a form of care. It required attention, patience, and humility. It accepted that humans were imperfect and that systems must accommodate that imperfection rather than deny it. Though this world has long faded, the quiet appeal of restorative justice continues to resurface whenever rigid systems fail to heal what they punish. In those moments, echoes of the Druidic understanding can still be felt, reminding us that true justice does not bind with chains, but with responsibility, memory, and a shared desire for balance. In many later retellings of ancient societies, women appear only at the edges, silent or symbolic, their roles reduced or erased entirely. Yet within the world shaped by the Druids, this absence tells a misleading story. The spiritual and social landscape they inhabited allowed space for women, not as exceptions, but as integral participants in the balance they sought to maintain. Wisdom was not confined to one gender. It moved where attentiveness, discipline, and insight allowed it to move. The sacred was not imagined as exclusively masculine. It carried feminine dimensions that were equally powerful, equally necessary. Fertility, intuition, transformation, and endurance were not secondary qualities. They were central forces woven into the structure of existence. The Druids understood creation not as a single act, but as an ongoing process of gestation, birth, decay, and renewal. Within this cycle, feminine energy was not passive. It was generative. Women served as seers, healers, poets, and teachers. Some were trained within the same traditions as male Druids, while others held parallel roles rooted in different expressions of sacred knowledge. These distinctions were not rigid hierarchies, but variations of emphasis. Wisdom took many forms, and the community benefited from their interplay. The act of seeing beyond the surface of things was often associated with feminine insight. This was not because women were believed to be mystical by nature, but because attentiveness, patience, and emotional depth were recognized as forms of intelligence. Listening deeply, sensing shift before they became visible, and understanding the unspoken currents within people were valued skills. These abilities shaped leadership, quietly rather than through command. Healing traditions, in particular, often flowed through women. Knowledge of plants, cycles of the body, and the subtle relationship between emotion and illness was passed carefully across generations. This was not informal folk practice separate from spiritual life. It was sacred knowledge, respected and protected. Healing was understood as restoration of balance, not simply the removal of symptoms. The cycles of the female body mirrored the rhythms of the land in ways the Druids found deeply meaningful. Menstruation, pregnancy, and birth were not sources of shame or secrecy. They were manifestations of creative power. The blood that signaled fertility was linked symbolically to the earth's own cycles of abundance and rest. This connection reinforced reverence rather than fear. Women also played vital roles in preserving memory. Stories, songs, and genealogies were often carried through maternal lines. Children learned first from their mothers, absorbing language, myth, and moral understanding long before formal instruction began. This early shaping of worldview gave women quiet but profound influence over cultural continuity. Leadership within Druidic societies did not always announce itself loudly. Authority could exist without dominance. A woman's counsel, offered calmly and consistently, could shape decisions as surely as any formal decree. This kind of influence was not invisible to those who lived within it, even if later observers failed to recognize it. Mythology preserved echoes of this balance. Female figures appeared not only as lovers or mothers, but as guardians of thresholds, arbiters of fate, and embodiments of the land itself. Goddesses associated with rivers, sovereignty, and wisdom reflected the belief that the feminine was inseparable from power. To rule justly was often portrayed as requiring harmony with these forces. The sacred feminine was also linked to transformation. Many stories featured women who guided heroes through periods of trial, loss, and rebirth. These figures did not conquer through force. They altered the course of events through insight, timing, and understanding of deeper patterns. Change arose not from violence, but from alignment. This worldview discouraged rigid separation between masculine and feminine roles. Qualities were not owned by one gender alone. Courage could be gentle. Strength could be quiet. Wisdom could be emotional as well as intellectual. Balance depended on integration rather than opposition. As external influences arrived, particularly those that favored hierarchical and patriarchal structures, this balance began to erode. Written histories, shaped by male-dominated institutions, often minimized or misunderstood women's roles in earlier cultures. Spiritual authority narrowed. The sacred feminine was reinterpreted or suppressed, framed as disorder rather than wisdom, yet traces remained. Folk traditions preserved powerful female figures long after official narratives shifted. Stories of wise women healers and protectors of the land continued to circulate, even when their origins were obscured. These remnants suggest that the older balance was never entirely lost. It simply moved into quieter spaces. The presence of women within Druidic spirituality also shaped how communities understood power itself. Power was not solely about control or command. It was about nurturing continuity. It involved holding space for growth, mourning loss, and guiding transformation. These were not secondary concerns. They were foundational. In times of crisis, women often served as stabilizing forces. Their roles in maintaining social bonds, caring for the vulnerable, and preserving emotional coherence were essential to survival. This labor was not dismissed as private or domestic. It was recognized as vital to the health of the whole. The sacred feminine also influenced how the Druids related to the land. The earth was not a resource to be exploited, but a living presence to be respected. This perspective aligned naturally with feminine symbolism, but it was shared by the entire community. Care replaced conquest. Listening replaced domination. As later societies lost this balance, something subtle shifted in human relationship with the world. Nature became something to control. Knowledge became something to possess. Power became something to enforce. The older model, grounded in reciprocity and respect, faded into memory, yet the longing for it remains. Even now, people seek traditions that honor intuition, emotional intelligence, and connection to cycles of life. They search for ways to reintegrate what was separated. In this search, the echoes of Druidic balance resurface. To imagine women within the sacred world of the Druids is not to impose modern ideals onto the past. It is to recognize a complexity that later narratives flattened. Their presence was not revolutionary. It was natural, arising from a worldview that valued harmony over hierarchy. This balance did not eliminate conflict or inequality entirely. No human society does. But it offered a framework where wisdom could arise from many voices, where power was shared rather than hoarded, and where the sacred was understood as inclusive rather than exclusive. In remembering this aspect of the Druidic world, we glimpse a possibility that still speaks to the present, a way of seeing where strength does not require silence, where intuition stands beside reason, and where the sacred feminine is not hidden, but woven into the fabric of life itself, quietly sustaining it through cycles of change. To the Druids, the future was not a fixed destination waiting to be uncovered, nor a rigid script written beyond human reach. It was a living current, shaped by countless choices, natural rhythms, and unseen forces moving together. Prophecy, in this sense, was not about prediction for its own sake. It was about attentiveness. To foresee was to listen deeply enough to sense where the current was already flowing. Those known as seers were not separate from Druidic tradition. They emerged naturally from the same discipline of observation and restraint. Their insight did not come from sudden visions alone, but from long familiarity with patterns. They watched how seasons responded to subtle changes, how human behavior repeated itself, how imbalance announced its presence before becoming visible. Over time, this attentiveness sharpened into something that appeared to outsiders as foresight. Divination was never treated lightly. It was not entertainment, nor a tool for control. It carried risk, because to glimpse possible outcomes meant bearing responsibility for how that knowledge was used. A careless prophecy could plant fear. A poorly timed revelation could alter behavior in harmful ways. Because of this, seers were trained to speak with caution, often in symbols rather than declarations. Signs were gathered from many sources. The flight of birds, the behavior of animals, the movement of clouds, and the quality of silence in a place were all considered meaningful. These were not random omens interpreted arbitrarily. They were read in context, layered with memory and experience. A raven's call meant one thing in spring and another in winter. Meaning depended on relationship. Dreams occupied a special place in this practice. Sleep loosened the grip of conscious thought, allowing the mind to wander beyond its usual boundaries. Dreams were believed to open small doorways into deeper layers of reality, where time did not behave predictably. A dream could reveal a possibility rather than a certainty, a warning rather than a command. Dream interpretation required restraint. Not every dream was prophetic. Many were echoes of daily life, shaped by emotion and memory. Learning to distinguish between the two was part of the seer's discipline. Overinterpretation was as dangerous as dismissal. Balance remained essential. Trance states, achieved through rhythm, chanting, or prolonged stillness, were another means of listening. These states were not induced recklessly. They required preparation and grounding. The goal was not to escape the world, but to perceive it more fully. In these moments, seers described feeling less like observers and more like participants in a larger awareness. The future, as perceived through these practices, was never singular. Multiple paths existed, branching from present choices. Prophecy did not remove responsibility. It intensified it. Knowing that a certain action might lead to harm did not absolve anyone from choosing differently. If anything, it made the choice more urgent. Because of this, prophecies were often deliberately vague. They spoke in images rather than timelines. A falling tree, a rising tide, a broken circle. These symbols invited reflection rather than obedience. They allowed communities to prepare emotionally and morally without becoming rigid or fatalistic. Seers were not elevated above others as infallible authorities. Their insights were weighed alongside practical knowledge and communal wisdom. A prophecy that contradicted observed reality was questioned. Respect did not erase discernment. This prevented seers from becoming tyrants of fear or hope. The Druids understood that the act of foretelling could influence outcomes. To announce a disaster too clearly could make it inevitable by shaping behavior around fear. To speak of success too confidently could invite complacency. This awareness made silence a form of wisdom. Not every vision needed to be shared. In times of crisis, seers played a crucial role in calming rather than alarming. Their task was not to inflame emotion, but to contextualize it. They reminded people that upheaval was part of cycles, that endings and beginnings often overlapped. This perspective did not eliminate suffering, but it prevented despair from taking root. The relationship between prophecy and leadership was delicate. Kings and warriors often sought insight before major decisions. A seer's words had influenced the course of battle or the fate of alliances. This proximity to power made ethical restraint essential. A seer who manipulated outcomes for personal gain risked deep imbalance, not only socially but spiritually. Stories from later centuries often portrayed Druidic seers as dramatic figures, delivering cryptic warnings in moments of high tension. While such moments may have occurred, they do not capture the daily reality of prophetic practice. Most of it was quiet, gradual, and woven into ordinary life. It involved noticing small shifts long before they became crises. This form of foresight fostered humility. No one could see everything. Even the most skilled seer understood that their vision was partial. Mystery remained. Accepting this limitation prevented arrogance and encouraged collaboration. The future was not owned by any individual. The Druids' approach to prophecy also shaped their understanding of fate. Fate was not a force that crushed free will. It was the accumulated momentum of past actions interacting with present conditions. One could not escape it entirely, but one could influence its direction through awareness and choice. This belief made prophecy a tool for responsibility rather than resignation. Knowing what might come did not mean surrendering to it. It meant preparing wisely, acting compassionately, and accepting outcomes without bitterness when they arrived. As written traditions and rigid doctrines replaced this fluid understanding, prophecy often hardened into prediction. Certainty replaced possibility. Fear replaced attentiveness. The future became something to dread or exploit rather than something to approach with care. Yet even now, people instinctively look for signs. They sense shifts in mood, in weather, in collective behavior. They speak of intuition, of gut feelings, of moments when something feels about to change. These experiences echo the Druidic practice of listening rather than asserting. To listen for the future is to accept vulnerability. It requires admitting that control is limited, that knowledge is incomplete, and that wisdom lies as much in restraint as in revelation. The Druids embraced this vulnerability. It shaped their seers into guides rather than prophets in the modern sense. In their world, foresight was not about standing above time. It was about standing within it, attentive and responsive. The future was not something to conquer. It was something to meet with open eyes and steady breath. And in this quiet, disciplined listening, the Druids cultivated a relationship with time that was neither fearful nor naive. They acknowledged uncertainty without surrendering to it. They prepared without hardening. They spoke when necessary and remained silent when silence served balance better. This way of seeing the future did not promise safety or success. It offered something subtler and perhaps more enduring. The ability to move forward without blindness, guided not by certainty, but by awareness, patience, and respect for the unseen currents that shape all lives. When the Romans first encountered the Druids, they did not meet them as curious scholars or neutral observers. They met them as an expanding empire meets anything it does not fully understand, with suspicion sharpened by fear. Rome was a civilization built on roads, records, hierarchy, and control. Power was documented, codified, and enforced through visible authority. The Druids represented something profoundly different, and that difference unsettled Rome more than open resistance ever could. To Roman eyes, the Druids were invisible rulers. They commanded no legions, yet their words could stop armies. They held no official titles recognized by the empire, yet kings listened to them. They wrote nothing down, yet preserved laws, history, and belief across generations. This kind of influence did not fit within Roman logic. It could not be taxed, registered, or easily dismantled. Roman writers struggled to describe the Druids without projecting their own anxieties onto them. Some depicted them as philosophers, acknowledging their intellectual depth while subtly diminishing their authority by comparison to Greek thinkers. Others painted darker portraits, emphasizing rumors of human sacrifice and barbaric rituals. These accounts were not simply attempts at accuracy. They were tools. By portraying the Druids as dangerous or irrational, Rome justified its own actions against them. Fear played a central role in this narrative. The Druids did not merely resist Roman rule physically. They resisted it culturally and spiritually. As long as Druidic authority remained intact, Roman control would always be incomplete. Conquest of land meant little if loyalty and identity remained elsewhere. The Druids preserved an alternative worldview, one that did not center Rome as the axis of civilization. This made them uniquely threatening. A defeated tribe could be absorbed. A broken army could be disbanded. But a belief system carried in memory and ritual could not be destroyed with a single campaign. It lingered, adapting quietly, resurfacing where least expected. To Rome, this persistence felt like defiance. The Roman response was calculated. Rather than confronting the Druids solely on the battlefield, they targeted their influence. Sacred groves were destroyed. Assemblies were forbidden. Public rituals were suppressed. These acts were not random cruelty. They were strategic efforts to sever the bonds between people, land, and memory. Roman sources describe campaigns against Druidic strongholds with dramatic language, emphasizing both the strangeness and severity of what they encountered. These descriptions often dwell on spectacle, on emotional extremes, on scenes meant to shock Roman readers. Whether exaggerated or not, the intent is clear. The Druids were framed as a problem that needed elimination, not understanding. At the heart of Roman discomfort was the Druids' refusal to separate knowledge from morality. Roman law functioned independently of belief. Obedience mattered more than alignment. Druidic authority, by contrast, rested on perceived harmony with natural and moral order. This made it difficult to co-opt. You could appoint a Roman official, but you could not manufacture trust rooted in centuries of shared memory. The Druids also represented a competing concept of time. Rome looked forward, expanding endlessly, recording achievements, building monuments to permanence. The Druids looked outward and inward, emphasizing cycles, continuity, and return. To an empire obsessed with legacy, this lack of visible ambition appeared suspicious, even subversive. Roman governors quickly realized that tolerating Druidic practices undermined their own authority. A population that deferred to Druids for justice, ritual, and guidance could not be fully governed by Roman law. The solution was suppression disguised as civilization. Roman rule promised order, roads, trade, and written law, presenting itself as progress while quietly dismantling existing structures of meaning. This clash was not only political, but psychological. Roman culture prized clarity, hierarchy, and definition. The Druids thrived in ambiguity, symbolism, and oral nuance. Roman officials demanded declarations. Druids answered with stories. Roman power relied on visibility. Druidic influence operated quietly, invisibly, through trust. The destruction of sacred groves was particularly symbolic. These were not temples in the Roman sense. They were living spaces shaped by time and attention rather than architecture. To cut them down was to attack the heart of Druidic spirituality. It was also a statement. The land itself would be reordered according to Roman priorities. Accounts describe Roman soldiers hesitating before entering these groves, unnerved by the atmosphere and by the presence of Druidic figures who confronted them not with weapons, but with ritual and invocation. This hesitation reveals something important. Even armed and disciplined, Rome felt the weight of what it sought to erase. As oppression intensified, Druidic practice adapted. Some traditions retreated into secrecy. Others blended subtly with local customs, disguising older meanings beneath acceptable forms. This was not organized resistance, but survival through transformation. Memory shifted shape, becoming harder to identify, but not disappearing entirely. Rome interpreted this persistence as stubbornness or deceit. In truth, it reflected the resilience of oral culture. Without centralized text to destroy, there was no single point of failure. Knowledge scattered, fragmented, and endured in pockets of practice and belief. Yet the damage was real. The loss of communal gathering spaces, the disruption of training, and the silencing of public ritual weakened the transmission of knowledge. Over time, the chain of memory thinned. What survived did so unevenly, shaped by circumstance and chance. Roman victory, when it came, was not marked by the disappearance of Druids overnight. It was gradual. A generation trained less deeply, another trained not at all. Children learned Roman law before ancestral custom. Latin replaced local tongues in administration and record. The old ways did not collapse. They faded. This fading allowed Roman writers to claim triumph not just over land, but over belief. They presented the decline of the Druids as evidence of Rome's civilizing mission. What they did not acknowledge was how much had been lost in the process. A worldview centered on balance, listening, and restraint was replaced by one driven by expansion and order. The Roman gaze fixed the Druids in history as relics, curiosities, or villains. This gaze continues to shape modern understanding. Much of what is known about the Druids comes through Roman sources filtered by political motive. This does not render those sources useless, but it demands caution. What Rome feared most was not human sacrifice or superstition, but independence of thought. The Druids represented a way of knowing that could not be easily controlled. They answered to cycles rather than commands, to memory rather than decree. In an empire built on authority, this was intolerable, and yet Rome's very effort to erase the Druids ensured their lasting fascination. The silence that followed their suppression invites imagination. The gaps left in history become spaces of curiosity. What was important enough to be feared? What kind of wisdom survives only as rumor and echo? As Roman power eventually waned, the Druids were already gone, at least as a visible class. But the land remembered. Customs lingered. Stories endured. The Roman gaze, once sharp with suspicion, faded into history, while the questions it raised remained unanswered. In this encounter between empire and memory, neither side fully won. Rome imposed its order, but could not entirely erase what came before. The Druids lost their public voice, but not their presence. They withdrew into myth, folklore, and the quiet persistence of place. And perhaps that is the final irony. Rome, obsessed with permanence, eventually fell. The Druids, who trusted in permanence, remain, not as institutions or names in stone, but as a lingering sense that wisdom does not always announce itself, and that the most powerful forces are often those least visible to those who seek control. The decline of the Druids did not arrive as a single moment of collapse, nor as one dramatic ending that could be neatly recorded. It unfolded slowly, almost quietly, through a series of losses that accumulated over generations. By the time it became clear that something irreplaceable was vanishing, much of it had already slipped beyond recovery. What disappeared was not only a class of people, but an entire way of remembering, listening, and relating to the world. As Roman authority expanded and solidified, the spaces that once nurtured Druidic life began to change. Sacred groves were cut down not always out of malice, but out of efficiency. Forests were cleared for roads, farms, and settlements. What had once been places of gathering and teaching became fields or construction sites. Without these living classrooms, the context that shaped Druidic learning began to erode. Training, which once required decades of uninterrupted study, became increasingly difficult. Apprentices needed time, silence, and continuity. Roman rule introduced constant disruption. Young people were drawn into new systems of education, administration, and trade. Latin replaced local languages in public life. Written law replaced spoken memory. Even those inclined toward the old ways found fewer opportunities to commit fully to them. The Druids did not respond with open rebellion. Their strength had never lain in confrontation. Instead, many withdrew. Teaching became quieter, more selective. Rituals were performed in secret or disguised as something else. What had once been communal became private. What had once been shared openly became guarded. This retreat, while necessary for survival, carried its own cost. Oral tradition thrives on repetition and visibility. When stories are no longer told publicly, they lose the reinforcement that keeps them sharp. Variations creep in. Meanings blur. Over time, fragments replace coherent systems. Roman suppression was not always violent, but it was relentless. Laws restricted gatherings. Druidic authority was delegitimized. Public roles were stripped away. Even when individual Druids were not targeted directly, the structures that sustained them were dismantled. A tradition rooted in community cannot survive indefinitely without it. As generations passed, memory weakened. Students learned parts, not wholes. Rituals were remembered without their deeper context. Symbols endured, but their original meanings faded. The chain of transmission thinned, link by link, until it could no longer support the weight of the tradition. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with absence. People still sensed that something had been lost, even if they could not name it. Certain places felt different. Old sites retained an atmosphere that resisted explanation. Stories lingered, but they sounded incomplete, like echoes in a vast space. Later writers would describe this period as one of enlightenment and order, but beneath the surface, a profound amnesia had taken hold. The Druids had been more than spiritual leaders. They had been mediators between people and land, between past and future. Without them, that mediation fractured. This fracture changed how people related to nature. The land, once regarded as a teacher and participant in human life, became property. Forests became resources. Rivers became boundaries or utilities. The language of relationship was replaced by the language of ownership. This shift did not happen overnight, but accelerated as older frameworks dissolved. The loss also reshaped concepts of time. Cyclical rhythms gave way to linear progress. The year became a sequence of tasks rather than a living pattern. Darkness became something to overcome rather than inhabit. Rest became idleness. Silence became emptiness. The Druids had understood silence as fertile. In silence, memory deepened. In silence, listening sharpened. Without those who knew how to hold it, silence began to feel threatening or useless. It was filled quickly with noise, decree, and explanation. The fall of the grove symbolized more than environmental destruction. It marked the removal of spaces where humans remembered their place within a larger whole. When those spaces vanished, so did the daily reminders of humility and restraint. Human ambition, once tempered by reverence, began to stretch unchecked. Yet the disappearance was never complete. Certain elements proved stubborn. Folk practices preserved fragments of older rituals beneath new names. Seasonal celebrations continued, though their meanings shifted. Healing traditions survived in families. Stories of wise figures dwelling in forests or the edges of society echoed Druidic archetypes. These remnants often carried a sense of melancholy. They hinted at something deeper that could no longer be fully accessed. People felt the shape of what was missing without being able to restore it. This longing gave rise to myth. Myth filled the gaps left by history. The Druids became figures of legend, sometimes noble, sometimes terrifying, often exaggerated. These portrayals reflected more about the fears and desires of later societies than about the Druids themselves. Yet even in distortion, memory persisted. The silence imposed on the Druids also reshaped power. With moral authority removed from communal memory and placed into centralized institutions, obedience replaced alignment. Law no longer required understanding. It required compliance. Justice became impersonal. Balance became secondary to order. This transformation brought stability in some ways, but it came at a cost. Without voices trained to listen deeply, nuance faded. Decisions grew harsher. Adaptability decreased. Systems became efficient, but brittle. The Druids had accepted fragility as part of life. Their knowledge survived only through care. When care was replaced by control, resilience diminished. What endured did so rigidly, unable to bend when circumstances changed. As centuries passed, the absence of the Druids became normalized. New generations grew up without knowing what had been lost. Silence hardened into forgetting, and yet traces of unease remained. Something in the relationship between people and land felt incomplete. Even today, when people walk through ancient forests or stand among old stones, they often report a sense of presence, of quiet significance. This is not proof of survival in a literal sense, but it suggests continuity of feeling. The land remembers differently than people do. It holds layers. The fall of the Druids was not a failure of belief. It was a result of a world that no longer made space for listening. Their silence was not chosen freely. It was imposed by structures that valued permanence over presence, records over memory, expansion over balance. Yet silence has a paradoxical power. What is not spoken can still be felt. What is not written can still influence. The Druids vanished from public life, but they entered imagination. They became symbols of a lost relationship with the world, one rooted in respect rather than domination. This transformation, from living tradition to shadow, ensured that the Druids would never truly disappear. They would persist as questions rather than answers, as reminders rather than authorities. Their fall turned them into a mirror, reflecting what later societies had gained and what they had sacrificed in the process. In this way, the silence that followed the fall of the groves was not empty after all. It was heavy with meaning. It carried the weight of a world that had known how to listen, and the quiet warning of what happens when that skill is forgotten. When Christianity began to spread across the lands once shaped by Druidic thought, it did not arrive as a sudden storm sweeping everything away. Its movement was slower, uneven, and often subtle. Conversion was rarely a single moment of rejection. More often, it was a long process of layering, where old meanings were not erased outright, but reshaped, renamed, and absorbed into new forms. The sacred world of the Druids did not vanish overnight. It changed its clothing. Missionaries who entered these regions quickly realized that total destruction of existing belief systems would invite resistance. The land was already saturated with meaning. Rivers, groves, hills, and seasons were embedded in the emotional and spiritual lives of the people. To strip these places of significance entirely would leave a vacuum that could not easily be filled. So instead, Christianity adapted. Sacred sites were not always abandoned. Many were reinterpreted. Springs once associated with healing spirits became holy wells. Groves gave way to churches built on familiar ground. Festivals marking seasonal transitions were folded into the Christian calendar, their symbols softened but not erased. What had once honored cycles of nature was reframed as celebrations of saints, martyrs, or divine events. This process was not entirely cynical. Many early Christian figures genuinely believed they were guiding people toward a deeper truth, not annihilating their heritage. But the effect was profound. As old stories were retold with new endings, their original meanings thinned. The language of cycles gradually gave way to the language of salvation. Time, once circular and returning, became linear and final. The Druids themselves, already diminished by Roman suppression, had little institutional power to resist this transformation. Their teachings, preserved through memory rather than text, were particularly vulnerable to reinterpretation. Without a written canon to defend their worldview, they could not easily challenge new narratives imposed upon familiar practices. Yet absorption does not mean disappearance. Beneath Christian language, echoes of older ideas persisted. The reverence for saints often mirrored earlier reverence for local spirits or ancestral figures. The veneration of Mary carried traces of the sacred feminine once embedded in the land. The emphasis on pilgrimage reflected an older belief in meaningful places where the boundary between worlds felt thin. Monks, in particular, played a complex role in this transition. Many were deeply attuned to the rhythms of the land. Living in remote locations, tending gardens, observing seasons, and preserving oral histories, they unknowingly became caretakers of fragments of Druidic sensibility. Though their theology differed, their daily practices often aligned more closely with ancient ways than with urban ecclesiastical power. In monasteries, old stories were written down for the first time, though often filtered through Christian interpretation. Myths were reframed as legends. Deities became heroes or demons. Wisdom figures were turned into cautionary tales. What survived did so in altered form, stripped of theological authority, but preserved as cultural memory. This transformation was not without tension. There were moments of resistance, quiet and overt. Some communities clung to older practices, blending them so thoroughly with Christian ritual that separation became impossible. Others abandoned them reluctantly, sensing loss but lacking alternatives. The shift also altered humanity's relationship with nature. While Christianity did not inherently reject the natural world, its emphasis on transcendence encouraged a subtle distancing. The land became creation rather than companion. Sacredness moved upward and inward, away from rivers and forests, and toward heaven and scripture. This did not happen uniformly. In rural areas, where daily survival still depended on close observation of natural cycles, older ways lingered longer. Folk Christianity developed, rich with rituals, charms, and seasonal customs that bore unmistakable traces of pre-Christian belief. Official doctrine tolerated some of these practices while condemning others, drawing an uneven boundary between acceptable tradition and forbidden superstition. Over time, the Druidic worldview became increasingly invisible. What remained was fragmented, misunderstood, and often dismissed as ignorance. Yet invisibility can be a form of survival. By slipping beneath dominant narratives, older ideas avoided total eradication. They endured quietly, waiting for contexts in which they could be reimagined. The absorption of Druidic elements into Christianity also reshaped the church itself. Local expressions of faith became texture by place. Christianity in these regions did not look identical to its Mediterranean origins. It carried the accent of the land, shaped by weather, memory, and inherited sensibilities. This blending complicates simple narratives of replacement. It was not a clean break between pagan and Christian, but a long conversation marked by compromise, loss, and continuity. Something ended, but something else persisted, transformed but recognizable to those who knew how to look. The cost of this transformation was subtle but significant. The Druids' emphasis on listening to the land, on balance rather than obedience, on cycles rather than finality, gradually faded. Moral authority shifted from communal memory to written doctrine. Silence lost its sacred role. Explanation replaced mystery. Yet the longing for what was lost did not disappear. It reemerged in mysticism, in monastic contemplation, in poetic visions of a world alive with divine presence. Even within Christianity, voices arose that emphasized immanence, humility, and reverence for creation. These voices often stood at the margins, echoing older ways of seeing. The absorption of Druidic traditions into Christianity ensured that the past was never fully severed from the present, but it also ensured that the past could no longer speak in its own voice. It spoke through symbols softened by time, through rituals stripped of their original context, through landscapes renamed but not forgotten. This quiet transformation reshaped Western spiritual consciousness. It replaced a worldview grounded in reciprocal relationship with one oriented toward salvation and authority. The change brought new forms of meaning, but it also narrowed the range of how humans understood their place within the living world. And yet, beneath churches built on old ground, beneath saints whose stories echo older myths, beneath festivals that still mark turning points of the year, the land continues to whisper. The absorption was never total. Memory remains embedded in soil, stone, and custom. In this way, the meeting of Druids and Christianity was not only an ending, it was a merging that reshaped both. The Druids lost their public voice, but fragments of their world entered the bloodstream of a new tradition. Christianity gained ground, but in doing so, it absorbed traces of an older reverence that would continue to surface in unexpected ways. What remains is not a clear inheritance, but a layered one, a sacred landscape rewritten, not erased, a silence filled with echoes, and a reminder that belief systems rarely vanish completely. They transform, adapt, and endure, hidden within the structures that replace them, waiting to be felt by those who still sense that the world once spoke in many voices, and that some of those voices never entirely fell silent. As the centuries passed, the Druids slipped further from historical record and deeper into the realm of myth. Their real presence, once tangible in groves, riversides, and communal life, became filtered to the eyes of later generations, interpreted, romanticized, or vilified according to the needs and imaginations of those who wrote afterward. History began to bend toward story and story toward legend, leaving the Druids suspended somewhere between fact and imagination, elusive yet compelling. In this process, the lines between the Druid as a historical figure and the Druid as a mythic archetype blurred. Writers, poets, and chroniclers sought to capture the essence of what had been lost, often exaggerating what little they knew into dramatic imagery. A Druid could be a wise counselor, a powerful magician, a mediator between worlds, or a sinister figure who commanded fear and awe. These portrayals were shaped not by the Druids themselves, but by the anxieties, desires, and cultural frameworks of later observers. Yet even in distortion, the essence of the Druids, their role as keepers of wisdom, interpreters of nature, and mediators between the human and the sacred, remained visible. Myth allowed the Druids to persist in ways that history alone could not. Where written accounts were sparse, legend flourished. In stories told at firesides and sung in the quiet of village halls, the Druids became larger than life, able to traverse time and geography. They were immortalized in tales of guidance, transformation, and revelation, often acting as a bridge between the mortal world and the unseen forces that governed existence. These myths preserved not factual detail, but the underlying principles of their worldview: balance, attentiveness, reverence for nature, and the continuity of knowledge across generations. In the retelling of these legends, Druidic wisdom became symbolic. The specific rituals and teachings, once concrete practices rooted in land and season, transformed into narrative motifs that represented universal truths. The oak, once a living teacher, became a symbol of endurance and knowledge. Mistletoe, once harvested with solemn care, became emblematic of mystery and sacred thresholds. Rivers and stones, previously loci of teaching and ritual, came to represent the unseen currents of life and fate. These symbols made the Druids timeless, allowing them to speak to generations long after their formal institutions had vanished. Storytelling also reframed the Druids as arbiters of morality and justice in ways that were often more dramatic than reality. Where history remembered their decisions in the quiet assessment of balance and harmony, Myth magnified these actions into acts of heroic judgment or supernatural intervention. They became mediators not only in human affairs, but in cosmic struggles, able to see the threads of fate where others perceived only chaos. This amplification served a dual purpose. It preserved the cultural memory of the Druids while also reinforcing their mystique for audiences who had little access to the subtler truths of their practice. Romanticized portrayals frequently emphasized the Druids' connection to nature, though the lens was often nostalgic rather than accurate. They were depicted wandering misty forests, chanting under moonlit skies, and invoking the forces of wind, water, and earth. These images resonated deeply because they echoed a collective memory of a world once more attuned to cycles, seasons, and subtle rhythms. Even when the details were fictionalized, the stories retained emotional truth that the Druids embodied a mode of being in which human life was entwined with the living landscape, where observation and patience were more powerful than force. As myth evolved, it also allowed for reinterpretation according to the values and anxieties of the age. Medieval chroniclers often cast Druids as either wise guides or dangerous heretics, reflecting contemporary concerns about orthodoxy, power, and moral order. Later, during the Renaissance and the Romantic period, Druids were imagined as custodians of ancient wisdom, symbols of a lost purity and connection to nature that contemporary society had abandoned. Each retelling layered new meaning atop old foundations, transforming the Druids into mirrors reflecting both the past and the preoccupations of those looking back upon it. Through this process, Druids became inherently liminal figures, existing between history and legend, the mortal and the sacred, the visible and the unseen. Their mythic status allowed them to carry forward ideas that might otherwise have been forgotten: reverence for cycles, ethical responsibility, and attentiveness to the land persisted in symbolic form. Even as their original social roles disappeared, the essence of their worldview survived in cultural memory, ready to influence new generations in ways subtle yet profound. The blending of fact and myth also affected how the Druids were imagined in popular culture. By the time stories were written in the medieval period, there was little concern for historical accuracy. Chroniclers freely interwove Druidic motifs with Christian symbolism, heroic narrative, and allegorical lessons. They were capable of presiding over battles, guiding kings, or performing acts of sorcery that reflected both fear and admiration. These tales were designed not to instruct in ritual, but to convey the moral and spiritual weight the Druids had once carried. Interestingly, the mythologizing process also preserved a sense of continuity in human engagement with nature and knowledge. Even when the Druids' teachings were obscured by layers of story, the underlying questions they had asked, how to live harmoniously within a community, how to respect the cycles of the world, how to listen for unseen forces, remained embedded in cultural consciousness. Myths function as vessels for ethical reflection, suggesting that wisdom was not entirely dependent on the survival of institutions or texts. The Druid as legend became a symbol of resistance to both time and erasure. Even after centuries of Roman suppression and the absorption of pre-Christian traditions into Christian practice, stories of the Druids endured. They survived as archetypes that could be summoned when societies felt disconnected from memory, nature, or ethical balance. In this sense, myth granted them a form of immortality that factual history alone could not provide. Yet, this immortality was fragile. Myths, while enduring, are always subject to reinterpretation and distortion. Each generation reimagines the Druids according to its own fears, ideals, and desires. Their wisdom can be flattened into superstition, their authority exaggerated into magical omnipotence, their connection to the natural world romanticized to the point of fantasy. What remains consistent, however, is the recognition that these figures represent something lost and longed for, a way of understanding the world that valued attentiveness, balance, and reverence above control and domination. This symbolic survival has shaped modern imagination of the Druids. They are invoked in literature, folklore, and popular culture as wise elders, mystical teachers, or keepers of ancient secrets. Their presence evokes the sense that knowledge is more than information. It is understanding, rooted in careful observation, ethical reflection, and continuity across time. Even when fictionalized, they remind audiences of a world in which wisdom was inseparable from place, and learning required patience, discipline, and attentiveness. In the transition from history to legend, the Druids also became a lens through which later societies examined themselves. Their stories invite reflection on what is valued, what is lost, and what survives when external authority reshapes cultural memory. They function as a mirror, revealing both admiration for their ethical and spiritual discipline and anxiety over the fragility of such systems in the face of political, social, or technological change. The mythologizing of the Druids also reinforced their liminality in the moral and spiritual imagination. They inhabit spaces that are both familiar and mysterious. Forests, rivers, and hills that are tangible and real, yet imbued with symbolic significance. Their liminality allows them to bridge worlds, past and present, human and divine, seen and unseen. This quality makes them enduring subjects of fascination, capable of carrying meaning across centuries, even when their historical footprint is faint. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Druids as myth lies in their embodiment of attentive listening and ethical action. While the details of their rituals may have been lost or transformed, the principles that guided them, observation, patience, balance, and reverence, remain accessible through their stories. Myth allows these principles to persist not as rigid instructions, but as invitations to notice, to reflect, to act with care, and to remain aware of the larger forces in which human life is embedded. In this way, the Druids, long after their historical presence faded, continue to inhabit the human imagination as guides, warnings, and exemplars. Their transformation into myth was not a loss of meaning, but a translation into a form that could endure when their physical and institutional foundations were gone. They became symbols of what humans once knew about listening, observing, and participating in a world that is alive with connection, memory, and cycles of continuity. The line between history and legend blurs, but the essential lessons, the quiet wisdom, and the moral resonance of the Druids persist, waiting to be perceived by those willing to listen. Long after the public presence of the Druids had faded, their influence lingered quietly, woven into the fabric of medieval culture in ways that were subtle yet profound. Monks, bards, and local storytellers became the unlikely custodians of fragments of Druidic knowledge, preserving not the rituals themselves, but their echoes transformed through oral memory and poetic interpretation. Where the groves once stood as centers of learning and observation, monasteries and courts carried the remnants of that attentiveness, embedding them within the moral and spiritual practices of the time. The monasteries of medieval Europe became centers of continuity in a different form. Though Christian in theology, they were repositories of memory, observation, and reflection, qualities that the Druids had prized above all. Monks copied manuscripts, chronicled local histories, and preserved poetry that had passed through oral tradition. In doing so, they inadvertently safeguarded strands of the cultural fabric the Druids had once maintained. The careful observation of cycles, whether lunar, seasonal, or agricultural, continued to influence monastic life, though it was reframed within Christian cosmology. The disciplined attention to rhythm, pattern, and timing that the Druids had cultivated now found echoes in the daily routines of prayer, work, and contemplation. Bards, too, carried Druidic memory into medieval life. They were more than entertainers. They were living archives, responsible for recounting genealogies, histories, and heroic tales. In these performances, lessons in ethics, social conduct, and the relationship between humans and the natural world were preserved, even if the original sources were forgotten. The bardic tradition often intersected with Christian festivals, yet retained elements of the older oral culture, repetition, metaphor, and the embedding of knowledge in story rather than in static text. Through their songs, they kept alive the patterns of thought, the moral reasoning, and the reverence for nature that had been central to Druidic practice. In this period, memory became even more critical. Literacy remained rare, and written records were concentrated in ecclesiastical centers. For most people, learning remained primarily oral, transmitted by those who have been trained over long periods to observe, recall, and narrate. This mirrored Druidic methods in many ways, though the content had shifted. Knowledge was still layered, contextual, and relational. A story told to a child in a village by a bard could contain history, law, morality, and myth simultaneously, maintaining the complex structure of meaning that the Druids had once relied upon. The blending of Druidic remnants with Christian moral and theological frameworks created a layered cultural memory. Ancient sites, such as stone circles or riverbanks, were reinterpreted as markers of saints or events in Christian history. Rituals and seasonal celebrations persisted under new names. Beltane and Samhain, for example, survived as festivals whose outward form was Christianized, but whose temporal and symbolic rhythms echoed the cycles the Druids had revered. Through these adaptations, the landscape itself remained charged with layered significance, allowing people to maintain an unconscious link to the older ways even as official structure shifted. This continuity was reinforced by the way moral authority was enacted. Medieval society, like Druidic society before it, relied on individuals who embodied ethical principles through their conduct. Kings and nobles often consulted advisors who had inherited traditional knowledge, just as communities had once turned to Druids for judgment. These advisors were not necessarily literate, yet they carried memory and discernment, shaping decisions through accumulated observation and ethical reasoning. In this way, the functions that Druids had once fulfilled, mediators, advisors, interpreters of law and balance, remain embedded in social practice, even if the original teachings were no longer visible. Poetry and legend played a critical role in preserving Druidic influence. Stories of ancient heroes, mystical forests, and wise elders survived as popular narratives, even as their original meanings were reinterpreted. The moral and ecological sensibilities embedded in these tales continued to guide behavior, reinforcing ideas about moderation, respect for the land, and the consequences of imbalance. While the explicit rituals of the Druids were no longer practiced openly, the principles underlying their worldview persisted in the rhythms of medieval storytelling and the moral lessons drawn from them. Education, too, bore subtle traces of Druidic influence. While formal schooling became increasingly tied to monasteries and cathedral schools, the pedagogical principles echoed older oral traditions: repetition, layered narrative, memorization, and contextual learning. Students were trained to observe patterns, recall stories in full, and understand the relationships between events, causes, and consequences. This approach, though embedded within Christian content, mirrored the Druidic emphasis on cultivating the mind as a living repository of interconnected knowledge rather than a passive container for facts. The integration of Druidic remnants into medieval life also had geographical significance. Certain sacred sites retained power as local landmarks, even when reinterpreted within Christian narratives. Springs, hills, and forests continued to be treated with reverence, often becoming the loci of pilgrimages or community gatherings. In these spaces, the connection between human life and natural cycles, the foundation of Druidic teaching, persisted subtly, guiding seasonal labor, festival timing, and communal reflection. The land itself became a bridge between past and present, carrying echoes of knowledge that could not be fully documented or codified. The moral and ethical framework of medieval communities, while shaped by Christianity, also reflected Druidic sensibilities and practice. Justice was not only a matter of law, it was tied to memory, relationship, and consequence. Disputes were mediated through local leaders who relied on recollection, precedent, and communal understanding rather than written statute alone. Ritualized reconciliation, compensation, and restoration echoed Druidic emphasis on balance and harmony. Communities continued to operate through networks of trust and accountability, preserving the relational ethics that the Druids had fostered. Even superstition and folklore can be understood as repositories of this older memory. Tales of spirits, omens, and sacred animals were not merely entertainment. They functioned as mnemonic devices, carrying moral, ecological, and social lessons across generations. These stories encoded knowledge about human behavior, seasonal cycles, and environmental awareness, echoing the pedagogical methods of the Druids. The narratives were adaptable, allowing for reinterpretation while maintaining the structural integrity of their lessons. The persistence of Druidic influence in medieval Europe demonstrates the resilience of oral and relational knowledge systems. By the time the Romantic era dawned in Europe, the Druids had long since ceased to exist as a formalized class or functioning social institution, yet their presence lingered in memory, folklore, and imagination. The centuries of suppression, absorption, and transformation had rendered them distant figures in historical reality, but simultaneously, their essence had become fertile ground for reinterpretation. Writers, poets, antiquarians, and philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries began to view them not merely as relics of the past, but as symbols of a lost wisdom, a bridge to a more harmonious relationship with the natural world, and a repository of ethical, spiritual, and ecological insight that had been overshadowed by the mechanistic and hierarchical values of modernity. This period saw the Druids elevated from historical figures to archetypes. No longer confined to sparse accounts of Roman chroniclers, they became emblematic of vanished continuity of thought, a human presence deeply attuned to nature, morality, and the cycles of life. Romantic writers, yearning for authenticity and connection amid the rapid social and technological changes of industrializing Europe, cast the Druids as sages of primordial wisdom, individuals who had lived in intimate dialogue with the land and with the unseen forces that shaped existence. The romantic Druid was both a cautionary figure and an aspirational one, a repository of virtues that the modern world seemed to have lost, including attentiveness, patience, ethical subtlety, and reverence for the environment. In this reinterpretation, the landscape itself became central. Writers describe mist-laden forests where Druids performed rituals under ancient oaks, rivers where they discerned cycles of life and time, and stone circles that served as both astronomical instruments and sacred meeting places. The natural world was not a backdrop to human activity, but a participant in moral and spiritual order. The romantic imagination amplified what historical Druids had quietly understood, that life, law, and morality were intertwined with the rhythms of the earth, and that attunement to these rhythms cultivated both personal and communal harmony. The Romantic Revival also reframed the Druids' relationship with knowledge. Whereas historically they relied on oral memory, disciplined observation, and apprenticeship, Romantic portrayals often highlighted a mystical dimension, emphasizing insight, foresight, and communion with nature as sources of profound understanding. In these accounts, Druids were seen as intermediaries not only between humans and the spiritual world, but between humanity and the cosmos, their wisdom transcending mere practical guidance to encompass moral and philosophical vision. This vision resonated strongly in an age increasingly concerned with mechanization, abstraction, and social upheaval, suggesting an alternative mode of engagement with the world, rooted in observation, reflection, and ethical responsiveness rather than domination. Romantic writers were particularly fascinated by the Druids' liminality, their existence at thresholds. They inhabited spaces that were both human and non-human, both temporal and eternal. Their groves were physical and symbolic. Their rituals were acts of both memory and prophecy. By emphasizing this liminal quality, Romantic narratives positioned Druids as figures capable of bridging worlds, embodying a continuity that historical circumstances had interrupted. The notion that the Druids could navigate between realms, living and dead, natural and spiritual, human and cosmic, gave them an enduring symbolic power. They became a lens through which writers could explore questions about mortality, ethics, and humanity's place within the wider order of existence. This period also saw the Druids incorporated into emerging nationalist narratives. Antiquarians and scholars, particularly in Britain and Ireland, framed them as ancestral figures, emblematic of a native wisdom that predated Roman occupation and Christianization. By positioning the Druids as custodians of an authentic, pre-modern culture, these narratives served both cultural and political purposes. They were invoked to argue for continuity with a venerable past, a claim to historical identity, and a sense of legitimacy rooted in memory rather than imperial decree. The Druids thus became symbols of cultural resilience as well as moral and spiritual authority, their figures shaped as much by contemporary needs as by historical reality. Within the Romantic imagination, Druidic rituals were often portrayed with heightened theatricality. Fire, mist, and shadow were emphasized as agents of transformation, echoing the sensory attentiveness that historical Druids cultivated, but expanding it into the realm of aesthetic and spiritual experience. Seasonal ceremonies, celebrating solstices, equinoxes, and harvests, were depicted as elaborate orchestrations of cosmic order in which human action resonated with natural cycles. These descriptions, though stylized and often embellished, preserved the underlying principle that timing, attention, and reverence were central to Druidic practice. The dramatic flourishes of Romantic retellings amplified the sense of awe and mystery, transforming historical observances into narrative vehicles for exploring human engagement with time, nature, and morality. Poetic interpretations further emphasized the Druidic connection to wisdom and ethics. Druids were cast as moral exemplars, whose understanding of human behavior was intertwined with an understanding of the natural world. Their authority was portrayed as deriving not from coercion, but from insight, ethical discernment, and the capacity to perceive patterns of cause and consequence invisible to most. This vision resonated strongly with Romantic ideals, which valued moral intuition, holistic thinking, and integration with the broader rhythms of life over mechanical reasoning or rigid adherence to law. Druids, in these accounts, represented a form of intelligence that was observational, relational, and deeply ethical. As the echoes of the Druids extended into the Romantic imagination, their symbolic and cultural significance grew beyond literature and art, permeating the emerging disciplines of archaeology, anthropology, and comparative mythology. Scholars and antiquarians began excavating ancient sites, uncovering standing stones, burial mounds, and stone circles scattered across Britain, Ireland, and northern Europe. These sites, long entwined with oral tradition and folklore, were often interpreted as evidence of Druidic practice, though the exact historical connection remained uncertain. In the absence of comprehensive records, imagination and interpretation filled the gaps, reinforcing the Druids' dual identity as historical actors and mythic figures. The material landscape became a canvas upon which the story of the Druids was continuously rewritten, reflecting both the vestiges of past practices and the desires of contemporary interpreters. Excavations of megalithic structures, including the famed stone circles of Avebury and the standing stones of Stonehenge, sparked renewed interest in Druidic culture. Although these monuments predated the historical Druids by millennia, they became associated with them through folklore and early antiquarian scholarship. Writers and explorers depicted Druids performing ritual observances beneath these monolithic structures, connecting celestial events, seasonal changes, and the movement of the sun and moon to sacred practice. These accounts often merged observation, speculation, and artistic imagination, but they reinforced the perception of the Druids as a civilization deeply attuned to both nature and cosmic order. The stones themselves were no longer inert relics. They were interpreted as active participants in a Druidic cosmology, marking cycles, sacred spaces, and thresholds between worlds. The revival of interest in Druidic culture during the 18th and 19th centuries coincided with the rise of Romantic nationalism. As European nations sought to assert distinctive cultural identities, the Druids were increasingly portrayed as symbols of indigenous wisdom and moral authority. Antiquarians emphasized their pre-Roman, pre-Christian origins, casting them as representatives of a native order that had endured long before foreign conquest. In Britain and Ireland, for example, the Druids were invoked as custodians of ancestral memory, protectors of the land, and transmitters of ethical and ecological understanding. This nationalistic framing imbued them with symbolic power far beyond their historical influence, transforming them into cultural icons capable of legitimizing emerging notions of heritage, identity, and moral continuity. Folklore and oral tradition continue to preserve elements of Druidic thought, often merging them with Christianized practices and seasonal rituals. Festivals aligned with solstices and equinoxes, such as Beltane and Samhain, persisted as markers of time and community cohesion, though they were reframed within Christian symbolism. Folk tales, songs, and legends preserved archetypes of wise elders, seers, and spiritual mediators, echoing the ethical and relational functions that Druids historically fulfilled. Even when distorted or mythologized, these narratives carried forward the principles of attentiveness, balance, and ethical action that had defined Druidic practice. Storytelling became a mechanism for cultural memory, allowing communities to retain continuity with the past while adapting to new religious and social frameworks. In the intellectual sphere, scholars began to interpret Druids as part of a larger comparative study of ancient religions and mythologies. The notion of a priestly, ethically guided, nature-attuned class resonated with broader inquiries into the development of human belief systems. The Druids were compared with shamans, oracles, and philosophers from other cultures, highlighting similarities in the use of oral tradition, ritual, and ethical mediation. Anthropologists and historians emphasize their role as custodians of knowledge and social cohesion, framing them as examples of societies that integrated moral, ecological, and spiritual understanding into daily life. This comparative lens reinforced perception of Druids as not only historical actors, but exemplars of universal principles of wisdom and ethical practice. The Romantic reinterpretation of the Druids also highlighted their connection to natural cycles and environmental stewardship. Writers and philosophers emphasized the ethical dimension of their relationship with the land, portraying them as guardians who mediated between human needs and ecological balance. Trees, rivers, stones, and the rhythms of the seasons were treated as teachers, moral guides, and symbols of continuity. This perspective resonated with contemporary critiques of industrialization, urbanization, and the exploitation of nature, presenting the Druids as exemplars of sustainable, attentive engagement with the environment. In this way, the Druids became moral models not only for human behavior, but for humanity's relationship with the living world itself. Artistic representations of Druids reinforced these themes. Paintings, illustrations, and literary descriptions emphasized atmospheric settings, mist-laden forests, dawn-lit hills, and sacred groves where rituals unfolded in harmony with seasonal cycles. The visual language of Romanticism, its focus on emotion, mystery, and grandeur, amplified the perception of Druids as mediators between the natural and the spiritual, the human and the cosmic. Artists often depicted ceremonies that incorporated celestial observation, fire, and ritual movement, echoing historical practices, while imbuing them with heightened aesthetic and symbolic significance. The aestheticization of Druidic practice allowed the principles of observation, balance, and ethical attention to resonate with audiences beyond historical or archaeological scholarship. Romantic narratives frequently emphasized the Druids' liminality, portraying them as figures who navigated thresholds between worlds. They existed simultaneously within human communities and in alignment with natural and cosmic forces, bridging life and death, visibility and invisibility, and time and eternity. This liminal status reinforced their appeal as symbols of wisdom and moral authority, capable of guiding individuals and communities through uncertainty and change. The perception of Druids as liminal figures also made them archetypes for philosophical and spiritual reflection, representing a mode of knowledge rooted in attentiveness, ethical reasoning, and relational engagement rather than coercion or rigid dogma. The study of Celtic mythology during this period further reinforced the Druid symbolic significance. Scholars and folklorists highlighted parallels between Druidic ethics, seasonal rituals, and the narrative structures of Celtic myths, suggesting that the Druids had served as custodians of cultural continuity and moral instruction. These analyses often blur the line between historical fact and literary interpretation, but they emphasize the enduring influence of Druidic principles.